Flight attendant tells black pastor to remove his cross, regrets it. 10 minutes later, Reverend Elijah Brooks stood in the dim glow of his modest kitchen, the smell of fresh coffee lingering in the air as the morning light slowly bled through the blinds. The early hour cast soft shadows on the framed photographs lining the walls, pictures of his late wife Deborah, smiling with her arms wrapped around their 2 sons in front of the church they built together. Time had aged those images, not just in color but in meaning. Each photograph held a piece of a life that once felt whole before illness hollowed it out. Today, though, the weight of his past didn't feel quite as heavy. Today was different. With slow, deliberate movements, Elijah reached for a small velvet pouch resting on the counter and drew out the wooden cross necklace. His fingers, calloused and sure, lingered over its surface. It was carved from cedar, sanded smooth by the hands of his father, a pastor, a protester, a man who once stood shoulder to shoulder with leaders of the civil rights movement. The cross had weathered decades, not just of time but of grief, sermons, baptisms, and hospital visits. Elijah had never once taken it off, not even to sleep. He slipped it over his head, the weight familiar and grounding against his chest. He glanced at the old clock above the doorway, 6:15 a.m., still early. His flight wouldn't board for another 2 hours, but he always arrived early, not out of anxiety but habit. As he zipped up his worn but clean suitcase and double-checked the address for the car service, he allowed himself a rare moment of anticipation. Washington, D.C., the nation's capital. He'd been invited to speak at a multi-faith conference on racial unity and healing, a gathering of pastors, imams, rabbis, scholars, and activists. Elijah had spent weeks preparing his words, revisiting old sermons, prayers, and speeches from the past. But his message wouldn't be political or academic. It would be personal, a story of survival, of faith in a world that often asked for silence in the face of injustice. He'd lived that silence, worn it like a second skin. Outside, the city had only just begun to stir. The street was still empty as Elijah locked the front door behind him and rolled his suitcase down the cracked pavement. He paused for a moment, gazing at the church across the street, the small red brick building with chipped paint and stained glass windows that had stood untouched by time and unnoticed by the city's wealthy newcomers. Gentrification had swallowed the surrounding blocks, replacing corner stores with wine bars and community centers with boutiques. But the church remained, battered but intact, held up by prayer and a congregation that refused to vanish. Elijah exhaled deeply, the early chill biting through his coat, and turned toward the waiting car. The drive to the airport was uneventful. The driver, a young man with headphones in his ears, nodded politely but kept to himself. Elijah didn't mind. He watched the city pass by through the window, memories drifting through his mind like passing clouds. His first sermon, Deborah's laughter echoing through the church kitchen. The Sunday mornings when the pews were packed, before the exodus of working-class families forced out by rising rents. He clutched the cross gently, not in fear or anxiety, but in reflection. Every scar, every loss, every triumph, it all lived inside that small wooden piece hanging over his heart. At the airport, the check-in process was smooth. Security, though tedious, passed without incident. Elijah had always been polite, soft-spoken, and easy to overlook. He didn't draw attention, nor did he seek it. As he made his way to the gate, he noticed how travelers moved like rivers, some rushing, some drifting. There were businessmen on phones, families wrangling toddlers, young couples speaking in hushed tones. He found a seat near a window and let himself settle, his Bible resting on his lap, unopened. The terminal announcements played overhead in monotone bursts, but he heard none of them. He was thinking of Deborah again, of how she would have teased him for ironing his shirt twice. She always knew when he was nervous, even when he tried to hide it. Boarding was called, and Elijah rose with the group. His row was toward the middle of the plane, not first class, not economy's last seat by the bathroom, just somewhere in between. As he stepped into the narrow fuselage, he nodded to the flight attendants at the door, receiving only a quick glance in return. He placed his carry-on carefully in the overhead bin and settled into his seat by the window. The view outside showed nothing yet, just a blur of tarmac and distant plains. He clasped his hands together briefly, not in show, but in quiet gratitude for safe travels. A few minutes later, a young man dropped into the seat beside him, breathless and jittery, his hands trembling slightly as he fumbled with his seatbelt. Elijah offered a kind smile. The young man noticed the cross around Elijah's neck, and after a moment, asked softly if he was a preacher. Elijah nodded, offering a brief story, not his whole history, just enough. He spoke of his father's hands carving that cross, of standing on milk crates as a boy to speak in church, of how faith wasn't always loud or certain, but something you chose every morning, even when the world told you it didn't matter. The young man listened, his shoulders slowly relaxing, his breathing calming as the engine hum began beneath them. The plane filled quickly. Passengers moved with practiced efficiency, coats off, trays up, phones out. Elijah sat quietly, looking out the window, letting the engine's low vibration steady his mind. But then came the glances. First from a man across the aisle, tall, bald, with sharp eyes that lingered too long on Elijah's cross. Then from a woman seated 2 rows ahead, who turned around just long enough to take notice of him before leaning in to whisper something to her companion. There was no confrontation, no words, just a slow, spreading frost in the air. Elijah felt it like a shift in weather, subtle but unmistakable. He was used to this in a way, the quiet judgments, the discomfort some people carried when confronted with a black man who didn't fit into their boxes, not loud or angry, not deferential or invisible, just present, just himself. Still, it stung, not for what it was, but for what it echoed, generations of coded disapproval wrapped in silence. But Elijah didn't shrink. He didn't turn away or hide the cross. He adjusted his posture, straightened his shoulders, and rested his hands calmly in his lap. The nervous young man beside him seemed unaware of the shift. He pulled out a small notepad and began writing. Elijah looked around once more. A steward further up the aisle made brief eye contact, then turned away. Another passenger pulled a scarf over her face, not in illness but in discomfort. Elijah didn't respond. He'd walked through worse doors, been told in subtler ways that he didn't belong. This was nothing new. Still, something felt different this time. Like the silence wasn't just passive, but waiting for something. Watching. He shifted slightly in his seat, the cross pressing against his chest with its usual comforting weight. The plane began to taxi, wheels rumbling under them. Elijah closed his eyes briefly and prayed, not for himself, but for whatever came next. Not knowing that in less than an hour, that simple, hand-carved cross would become the center of a storm he didn't see coming. Not knowing that this quiet flight to Washington would turn into a national reckoning. For now, there was only the low roar of engines, the tightening of seatbelts, and the slow, steady rise of a man who had already learned to fly through storms. The plane settled into a soft, mechanical hum as it began its slow journey toward the runway, the gentle vibrations rising through the floor and into Elijah Brooks's shoes. He sat still, one hand resting lightly on the armrest, the other holding onto the edge of his seat as he gazed out the oval window. The landscape outside shifted. Concrete runways stretched like veins across the open tarmac, support vehicles zipping between terminals, lights blinking in calculated rhythm against the morning haze. Elijah had rarely traveled far from his neighborhood in all his years. Funerals, weddings, hospital calls, council meetings. His life had always unfolded within the radius of a city bus line. Today was different. Today, he was climbing higher than he'd ever been, not just in altitude, but in meaning. And though the cabin around him buzzed with the quiet rituals of modern air travel, his heart remained calm, grounded by the weight of his purpose and the simple wooden cross hanging gently over his chest. The rows around him filled with a certain kind of energy, precise, transactional, sharp at the edges. Most of the passengers were professionals, judging by the suits, polished shoes, and muted conversations about client calls and deadlines. They seemed to move with the muscle memory of frequent flyers, plugging in devices, syncing emails, and adjusting noise-canceling headphones with choreographed ease. Elijah, in his modest navy jacket and worn brown loafers, felt the contrast, but not the shame. He knew who he was. His life wasn't measured by upgrades or priority boarding. His riches were the stories carried in calloused hands, the prayers offered in hospital rooms, the hugs of grieving mothers, the silence of sanctuary when words failed. Still, in the narrow aisle of this plane, among expensive watches and carefully groomed faces, he felt like a stranger stepping through a doorway that hadn't been opened for him. The flight attendants made their way through the aisle, their movements brisk but rehearsed, checking for seatbelts, overhead bins, tray tables. Most wore neutral expressions, polite and practiced. Then came Gregory Miles. Gregory appeared without fanfare, clipboard in hand, a well-ironed uniform hugging his lean frame. His hair was neatly trimmed, his jaw tight, his name tag polished to a shine. At first glance, he fit the image of a consummate professional. But there was a stillness in his gaze that lingered too long, a sort of calculation behind his eyes, the kind that sorted people before speaking to them. He carried himself with the assurance of someone who believed rules were sacred, and those who didn't fit them were liabilities. Gregory had a reputation among his colleagues for being precise. By the book was the phrase often used. And though no passenger had ever heard him raise his voice, he had a way of enforcing control with a kind of sterilized authority. He preferred order, predictability, and deference. And beneath his clean-cut presentation lived a discomfort he had never named, especially around confident black men who didn't try to make themselves small. When Gregory's eyes first landed on Elijah, there was no outward reaction. But something shifted. A flicker, almost imperceptible, crossed his face. His gaze dipped briefly to the wooden cross resting against Elijah's shirt, its edges dulled by years of wear but still prominent. Something about it made Gregory pause, then blink the thought away. He moved down the aisle, calling out the safety checks, motioning for a man to tuck in his bag, tapping a seatbelt with 2 fingers. Professional, efficient, polite. But as he circled back through Elijah's row, the temperature around him seemed to cool. The drink service began 20 minutes into the flight, and with it, the subtle performances of civility. Gregory maneuvered the cart down the aisle, his smile shallow and precise, asking what passengers preferred with the clipped rhythm of a practiced line. When he reached Elijah's row, the exchange was quick, even colder. Gregory's words were functional, void of warmth. Elijah, ever gracious, responded with a soft thank you and a nod, his posture open. Gregory didn't meet his eyes. The cup was handed off like a transaction, not a gesture. To the businessman beside Elijah, Gregory offered a pleasant comment about his tie. To Elijah, nothing more than the hum of wheels as the cart moved on. Elijah didn't bristle. He had known moments like this before, moments where politeness became a shield for something deeper, moments where his very presence seemed to unsettle people. He glanced around, noting the posture of those near him. The man across the aisle had been watching the interaction. When Elijah caught his eye, the man turned toward the window, stiff-backed. Elijah sighed softly and took a sip of water. He told himself it was nothing, that perhaps Gregory was simply tired, preoccupied. But the feeling remained, like a draft in a sealed room. The plane had now leveled, cruising high above the clouds, the sun glinting faintly against the metal wing outside. Elijah leaned back, letting his eyes close for a moment. He wasn't angry, just aware. There was a difference. Anger came and went. Awareness stayed. It reminded him of the times he walked into fundraising meetings for the church and saw the discomfort in the eyes of potential donors, or when city officials shook his hand but didn't hear his words, or when neighbors smiled but held their purses a little tighter when he passed by in his clergy collar. He wore grace-like armor, but grace wasn't always enough to soften the coldness of other people's fears. In the galley at the front of the plane, Gregory took a moment to collect himself. He wasn't sure why that cross had unsettled him. It wasn't overt. It wasn't even the cross itself, perhaps, but the way the man wore it, like a badge, with no attempt to hide it. Something about it made him feel challenged. He told himself it was policy, that perhaps religious symbols needed to be reviewed for security reasons. But that wasn't true, and he knew it. He'd seen passengers wear crosses before, stars of David, crescent pins. Nobody had batted an eye. Yet here he was, glancing down the aisle toward one quiet pastor and feeling like something needed to be corrected. The flight continued without disruption. Light turbulence caused some to grip their armrests, but Elijah remained still. He'd weathered worse storms. His mind drifted to his congregation, to the peeling paint in the children's room, to the letters from developers trying to buy out the church property. He thought of his wife's final days, her smile still strong even as her body faded, and how she used to trace the lines of his cross with her fingertips when they prayed. It gave him strength now, as it had then. He hadn't noticed Gregory watching him again. Not directly, just in passing glances, quiet assessments. Elijah felt the weight of being observed but chose not to react. He simply breathed, present in his body, in his mission, in the story he was carrying to Washington, a story of endurance, of community, of the quiet power in standing one's ground without raising a fist. Still, the air felt thicker. Something unspoken had begun to stir. Gregory returned to his station with narrowed eyes and a whisper of conflict rising within him. He didn't quite know what he intended yet. Perhaps nothing. Perhaps just a conversation. But beneath that, another question echoed. Why did that cross bother him so much? Elijah, unaware of the storm slowly building behind him, closed his eyes once more and rested his hand over the necklace. For him, it wasn't a statement. It was a memory, a legacy, a quiet defiance against erasure. A piece of his father's hope carved into cedar. He whispered a prayer under his breath, not for safety but for peace, for the strength to be who he was, even when the room grew cold. High above the clouds, the plane carried them both forward, two men, two worlds, inching closer to an invisible line neither of them yet saw. But it was coming, and when it arrived, it would reveal what silence had been trying so hard to hide. The flight continued its smooth journey high above the clouds, but something in the cabin had begun to shift. It was subtle at first, the kind of quiet tension that moved between rows like a draft no one acknowledged, but everyone felt. A man in a crisp blazer adjusted his seat with a loud sigh, muttering something about how warm the cabin had become. A woman 2 rows back pressed her call button, requesting a cooler setting, her voice lined with polite irritation. Another passenger, tall, pale, with a thin-lipped expression, glanced pointedly at a young couple laughing a little too freely in the row behind him. The flight attendants responded with the usual mix of routine and restraint, but none more sharply than Gregory Miles. Gregory had begun moving through the cabin with a new edge in his steps, scanning the aisles not just for safety, but for control. His eyes swept across each row like a lighthouse beam, brief, calculated, and searching for trouble before it announced itself. He had sensed the slight shift in passenger mood, the subtle discomforts building behind practiced civility, and now wore that tension like a badge. He adjusted his tie, checked his watch though he didn't need to, and moved down the aisle again, stopping here and there with just enough authority to remind the plane who held the reins. A crooked bag here, a tray table not fully locked there. Each correction was offered with the kind of professionalism that masked something colder beneath. Toward the middle of the cabin, Elijah Brooks remained quiet, seated upright with his reading glasses perched low on his nose. His Bible, worn at the edges and bound in soft brown leather, rested open across his lap. He read slowly, not as study but as centering. Verses that had comforted him in hospital rooms, held him steady in protests, and whispered strength into his ear on nights when grief felt too heavy to name. The cross around his neck caught the overhead light each time he shifted, a quiet shimmer against his dark buttoned shirt. He felt the shift in the cabin too, but said nothing. This wasn't new. Discomfort followed him into spaces where people weren't sure how to read him. A black man dressed plainly, calm but not small, wearing faith not as fashion, but as identity. Across the aisle, a boy no older than 16 leaned slightly toward Elijah, eyes catching the open pages. He wore a hoodie pulled halfway over his head and headphones around his neck. His expression held a mix of curiosity and hesitation. He asked softly about the passage Elijah was reading, his voice low enough not to disturb those nearby. Elijah turned, offering a warm nod, and explained that it was the book of James, a letter written not for the powerful, but for the weary, the scattered, the silenced. His words were gentle, unhurried, laced with the kind of peace that could only come from a life carried through storms. The teenager listened, his brows furrowed in thought, and for a few moments, the cramped cabin felt like a sanctuary. but Gregory had noticed. He had paused 3 rows back, watching the exchange. His frown wasn't immediate, but it deepened the longer he looked. He saw the open Bible, the cross resting proudly in full view, the young passenger leaning in with interest. Something about the image, something he couldn't quite name, unsettled him. It wasn't loud, it wasn't disruptive, but it lingered in his mind like static. The feeling built as he returned to the front of the cabin, standing beside the drink cart with arms folded, watching without watching. An hour passed. The plane dipped slightly as it met a pocket of turbulence. It wasn't dramatic, just enough to cause cups to tremble and seatbelt lights to flicker back on. Gregory seized the opportunity. He began moving through the rows again, citing safety checks, ensuring compliance, restoring the fragile order he felt slipping. When he reached Elijah's row, he paused. His eyes scanned the belts, but his gaze settled not on safety gear, but on the cross. Elijah looked up, sensing the attention. Gregory took a breath, then spoke, his voice level, but his words clipped. The man would need to remove the necklace, he stated. There was no request, only instruction. Elijah blinked, unsure he'd heard correctly. He asked, softly, if something was wrong. Gregory, standing rigid, repeated himself. He cited an airline policy, vague, undefined, about religious symbols that could cause discomfort to other passengers. The words were delivered with the certainty of someone not used to being questioned. Elijah's brows drew together. He touched the cross instinctively, the wood smooth beneath his fingers. He said in a calm but steady voice that the cross had been carved by his father, that he had never once removed it. Not for funerals, not for baptisms, not even when his wife was dying. Around them, the ambient cabin noise seemed to pause, as if the air itself was holding its breath. Passengers in nearby rows turned subtly, their expressions shifting from passive boredom to quiet curiosity. The teenager across the aisle straightened slightly, watching the interaction with growing unease. The businessman in the next seat stopped mid-sentence on his laptop, his eyes flickering toward the aisle. Gregory stood his ground, but his face betrayed a small crack in his authority, the flicker of being challenged by something he couldn't explain. He didn't respond to Elijah's explanation. Instead, he gestured again, insisting the item be removed to comply with policy. The word policy hung in the air like a gavel. Elijah didn't raise his voice. He didn't move. He simply asked, still calm, if the cross was truly the issue, or if something else was. The question wasn't pointed, but it carried weight. Gregory's jaw tightened. He didn't answer. He simply gave a tight nod and turned, moving briskly back up the aisle. The air left behind him was charged, quiet, but not settled. Elijah remained still, his hand over the cross, not in defense, but in memory. He could feel the gaze of nearby passengers. Some looked away quickly, embarrassed. Others stared openly, confused or curious. He leaned back slowly, breathing in the recycled cabin air, and reminded himself that peace wasn't always quiet. Sometimes it was choosing to stay still when others wanted you to shrink. The cabin returned to its routines, beverages being refilled, overhead bins rumbling with occasional shifts, the hum of engines rising again. But the moment had landed. A seed had been planted. Questions were beginning to form in the minds of those who had watched. Whispers started in row 5. A glance was exchanged in row 7. And Elijah, though unaware of every look, knew the feeling. It was the beginning of a shift, of truth pressing against pretense. He turned back to his Bible but didn't read. His eyes moved across the page, but his mind stayed in the moment. Gregory had drawn a line, and while it had not yet become a confrontation, it had become a choice. Elijah's fingers remained on the cross. He did not loosen it, did not tuck it into his shirt. He left it where it had always been, visible, unashamed, part of him. And across the cabin, a steward named Gregory Miles stood behind the galley curtain, exhaling slowly, his reflection staring back at him in the polished coffee pot. He told himself he was just doing his job, but the weight in his chest said otherwise. The cabin's atmosphere, already uneasy, grew denser with every second that passed. It was no longer just recycled air and idle conversation. Something invisible but heavy had settled between the rows. The passengers sensed it in the small silences, in the way eyes darted between Elijah and the aisle, in the sudden quiet that followed a loud soda can pop, or the rustle of a bag overhead. Gregory stood just a step inside Elijah's row now, his posture more rigid than before, voice louder as he repeated the demand. Not a suggestion, not a request, but a direct order. The cross must be removed. The tone, firm and publicly declared, drew the attention of more nearby passengers. Some looked up from their devices, others turned their heads slowly, unsure whether to pretend they weren't listening or lean fully into the unfolding moment. Elijah's seatmate, a man who hadn't said much since takeoff, looked at him now with clear discomfort, the way someone might look at a man being wrongly accused, but fearing that any intervention might invite trouble. Across the aisle, a woman paused her e-reader and raised an eyebrow, not in judgment but in calculated curiosity. She said nothing, but her body language echoed the thoughts many were beginning to share. Something about this didn't feel right. Elijah remained still. His hands rested on his lap, his shoulders square, posture composed but not confrontational. He looked at Gregory, not with anger, but with the quiet disappointment of a man who had seen this play out before, in courtrooms, in pews, in city council chambers where polite voices became weapons. With steady breath, Elijah explained what the cross meant, that it was not a political symbol, that it was not meant to provoke, that it had belonged to his father, and through him, to a legacy much older than either of them. It was the symbol of his calling, a life spent in service, in mourning with others, in standing with the broken-hearted. It was not fashion, it was who he was. Gregory's face did not soften. In fact, it hardened. The polite veneer he had maintained was thinning, replaced by the posture of a man who felt cornered by someone he had expected to obey. His irritation was no longer subtle. It edged into his words as he began to invoke airline protocol. He used phrases like non-compliance and interference with crew instructions, legal-sounding language clearly designed to create fear, to frame Elijah not as a man of peace, but as a problem to be managed. Gregory was no longer just enforcing a policy. He was defending his authority, and in doing so, escalating a situation that had begun as a quiet disagreement. Elijah asked, with controlled calm, if they could step aside and speak privately. The request was measured, intended to diffuse, to allow dignity to remain intact, but Gregory refused without pause. He stayed in the aisle, loud enough now that the cabin could hear nearly every word. The tone suggested that privacy was a privilege reserved for different kinds of passengers, the ones who didn't cause complications, the ones who didn't wear crosses carved from worn wood or speak with quiet conviction. The flight had become a stage, and Gregory seemed committed to keeping Elijah in the spotlight, whether he wanted to be there or not. A man seated behind Elijah, heavy-set and pale, leaned forward just enough for his voice to carry. He muttered a question into the space between rows, not directed at anyone in particular, but sharp enough to cut. If the pastor couldn't follow a simple rule, what else might he be hiding? The implication hung in the air like smoke. A woman nearby pulled her sweater tighter. Someone cleared their throat. Another passenger, younger and more tech-minded, pulled out his phone and began recording. The screen lit up the dim row, its lens aimed toward Elijah with quiet precision. The recording started without warning, turning Elijah's dignity into content. Inside his chest, Elijah felt the familiar heat of pressure rising, not anger, but that deep ache that came from being misunderstood, misjudged, and mishandled. Again. The same ache he'd felt as a boy when the store clerk followed him for no reason. The same ache he'd carried the day his wife was asked to move to the back of the clinic waiting room. The same ache he'd buried deep every time someone crossed the street to avoid walking beside him in daylight. He had trained himself to meet that ache with grace. Not silence, never silence, but grace. He looked down at the cross now, thumb pressing gently against its smooth surface. He was caught in the worst kind of trap. If he removed the cross, he would be complying with injustice, confirming the fear in others that his faith was somehow threatening. If he kept it on, he risked being labeled uncooperative or worse, dangerous. He thought of his sons, of the men he'd counseled in prison, of the youth in his neighborhood who were taught to make themselves small in public. He thought of the woman who had handed him a letter at church last Sunday, thanking him for reminding her that God sees those who are overlooked. And then, the silence. That pregnant, crackling silence before a man speaks a truth he knows will not be welcomed, but must be spoken anyway. Elijah raised his head. He looked directly at Gregory, not with challenge, but with the steadiness of a man who had built his life on something stronger than fear. With a voice that carried not force, but finality, he said he would not remove it, not in defiance, not in rebellion, but in faith, the same faith that had carried his ancestors through chains, through fires, through marches and hoses and courtrooms where justice was a whisper. The words didn't echo, but they landed. The cabin seemed to pause in response. A woman a few seats away adjusted her gaze, her face unreadable. A businessman lowered his laptop screen, his fingers still. Gregory didn't speak. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came. He had expected resistance, perhaps, but not this calm refusal, not this unwavering certainty in the face of public scrutiny. Elijah remained seated. He didn't rise. He didn't preach. He just held his ground, fingers resting on the symbol of everything that had made him who he was. He was not trying to make a scene. He was trying to hold on to something sacred. And somehow, in that stillness, the cabin felt smaller, more intimate, less like a place of escape and more like a place of reckoning. Above them, the plane hummed on, engine steady, wings slicing through blue. But inside, something had shifted. A line had been drawn, and everyone, whether they knew it or not, had just chosen a side. The change in atmosphere was immediate and undeniable. It wasn't something that could be traced to temperature or turbulence. It was tone, weighted and visible in the tightened shoulders, the hushed side glances, the awkward clearing of throats. The soft drone of the plane continued overhead, but inside the cabin, something vital had shifted. The tension had coiled tighter, like a rope pulled past its limit. Elijah remained still, fingers still gently curved around the wooden cross at his chest. Gregory, whose eyes once flickered with vague unease, now wore a hardened expression, his jaw tight and his movements sharp. Without another word, he spun on his heel and walked away down the aisle, brisk and officious, the authority of his uniform trailing behind him like a cape. Elijah didn't watch him go. He turned his eyes instead toward the small oval window beside him. The clouds floated silently below, oblivious to the human storm brewing just above them. He tried to steady his breath. This wasn't the first time his dignity had been made to stand trial without evidence. He had walked through board meetings where his voice was ignored until echoed by someone else. He had buried his wife with barely enough savings because the health insurance had run dry. He had sat in city chambers where gentrification was cloaked in business terms that disguised displacement. Silence had always been part of the assault, not screaming or fists, but the quiet exclusion, the quiet dismissal. He had learned to hold his silence, not as surrender, but as endurance. Still, even endurance wore thin. A few moments later, another figure appeared at his side. This one younger, perhaps in his mid-20s, and visibly nervous. The second flight attendant didn't meet Elijah's eyes directly. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other and spoke with the careful diction of someone repeating words he did not write. The head attendant was escalating the issue to the captain. Elijah simply nodded, as if he'd expected nothing less. In truth, he had. The machinery of small authority had begun to turn, gears clicking into place, roles falling into order. The escalation was not about safety. It was about control, about a man who felt undermined and needed the system to back him up. There was no apology in the young attendant's voice, only distance. A thin wall of professional detachment that said more than words could. Elijah didn't respond. He just turned his eyes back to the window and exhaled slowly through his nose. The cross at his chest grew heavier, not in weight but in meaning. It had been carved by his father in the flickering light of a one-room kitchen, back when they could barely afford groceries but never missed Sunday service. His father had once told him that true faith isn't tested in churches, but in moments where standing still feels like standing alone. Elijah hadn't expected to be tested in the skies above Ohio, but the place never mattered. The lesson did. 5 minutes passed. Not a sound from Gregory, not a word from the cockpit. Just the hum of the aircraft and the occasional beep from a phone being discreetly unlocked. People were watching now, not all, but enough. Some masked their curiosity behind open books or idle conversations. Others recorded, phones angled just low enough to feign subtlety but high enough to catch the frame. Elijah could feel it. The discomfort, the division. It wasn't about him wearing a cross. It was about what the cross meant when worn by a man like him. An older black man sitting alone, unbothered, unbowed. For some, that was enough to warrant suspicion. Then Gregory returned, and this time, he didn't come alone. A third crew member trailed behind him, more formally dressed, possibly a senior attendant or security liaison. Gregory's walk was different now, his chin raised slightly, his chest fuller. He carried himself like a man bolstered by something bigger, like a judge returning to deliver a verdict. When he stopped at Elijah's row, the silence returned with him, hovering like static. Passengers turned to listen, some overtly, others under the guise of stretching or adjusting pillows. Gregory's voice carried, not shouted, but pitched perfectly to travel 3 or 4 rows in each direction. Elijah was now considered a disruption to the flight. The captain had been informed. If he refused to comply with the crew's request, which was no longer framed as a suggestion but a directive, he would be met by airport security upon landing. The words were clean, measured, and delivered with the performative neutrality of someone trying very hard not to sound aggressive. But the threat was clear. Elijah would not be allowed to land in peace. There would be consequences, legal consequences, official consequences. The machinery had decided that his refusal to remove a small wooden cross rendered him a risk. Around them, the mood fractured. A woman clutched the edge of her tray table. A man in business attire leaned back and closed his eyes, as if disengaging would spare him from involvement. One man, a few rows up, glanced sideways and then quickly away. No one spoke in Elijah's defense. No one objected. But the cameras kept recording, silent and steady. This was the world now, watchful but unwilling, documenting injustice but rarely intervening. Elijah remained calm. He didn't raise his voice, didn't plead. He looked at Gregory, really looked at him, and stated clearly that a mistake had been made. Gregory blinked, the certainty in his posture faltering for the briefest second. Perhaps it was the confidence in Elijah's voice, or the lack of panic, or the strange sensation of a man refusing to bend even when bent upon. Gregory started to turn away, clearly expecting that the pressure he had applied would be enough to cause compliance. But then, just as he began to pivot down the aisle, a deep voice rose from the back of the plane. The voice cut through the silence like a bass note in a choir, not loud, but full, measured, commanding. It did not shout, but it carried. Heads turned, phones tilted. Even Gregory paused, half-turned, caught mid-step. The voice belonged to a man who had been silent this entire flight, tucked away in a window seat behind the last row of the business class section. He had boarded quietly, unnoticed. But now, his presence was impossible to ignore. The tone of his voice wasn't emotional. It was steady, direct, filled with the gravity of someone who had watched long enough and decided the time for watching had passed. His question wasn't rhetorical. It was laser-focused, laced with authority, and directed straight at Gregory. It was not a request for clarification. It was a challenge. A line had been crossed, and the man in the back had just drawn another. The cabin didn't erupt, not yet. But it shifted again, palpably. Because with that voice came something Gregory hadn't anticipated. Resistance. Not from Elijah, but from someone he hadn't accounted for. The tension hadn't snapped. It had deepened. And with it, the stakes. Something had begun to stir inside that plane, something that no protocol or policy could suppress. A reckoning. Quiet for now, but rising. The tension in the cabin had reached its breaking point, but it was at that moment, when the atmosphere felt almost suffocating, that a deep voice from the back of the plane cut through the chaos, loud and clear, carrying the weight of authority and purpose. "Are you serious right now?" The words were sharp but not frantic, steady but commanding. Heads snapped toward the sound, and passengers who had been avoiding the situation until then now turned their full attention to the figure moving toward the front of the plane. A tall, imposing black man in a well-fitted suit walked calmly up the aisle. His presence filled the space not with aggression but with quiet strength. Every step was measured, confident, and resolute. He wasn't loud, he didn't raise his voice, he didn't need to. His posture alone commanded attention. He wasn't some distant authority figure. He was someone who belonged here, someone who mattered. As he walked, there was a collective murmur of recognition among the passengers. The sharp-eyed ones, the ones who had been glued to their phones or watching discreetly from the periphery, began to exchange glances. The man was familiar. "You're harassing a pastor over a necklace?" The words were not a question so much as a statement, one that carried a quiet but undeniable truth. The flight attendant Gregory froze mid-step, his posture faltering as the voice of challenge hit him square in the chest. This new arrival wasn't just any passenger. He was a figure of stature, and not just in height. The tall man didn't stop at a polite inquiry or passive questioning. He pushed forward, unrelenting, and made his way toward Gregory and Elijah's row with a quiet certainty. The man introduced himself calmly. "I'm Reverend Marcus Slate," he said, his voice still calm but firm. His name alone caused ripples among the passengers. Reverend Marcus Slate. A name that carried weight, a nationally recognized faith leader, a man whose face had appeared countless times on news specials and televised sermons, someone whose words and opinions were sought after by media outlets. He was the type of leader who had shaped discourse, made waves with his social justice initiatives, and whose presence was impossible to ignore. Marcus Slate, as he approached, looked at Gregory with an unspoken understanding. There was no malice in his eyes, no anger, but rather a deep sense of responsibility. This wasn't about a personal disagreement. This was about principle, about standing up against something that had been wrong from the start. "This man is no threat," Slate continued, his voice carrying over the murmurs now rippling through the cabin. "He's a pastor." His words were simple but powerful. His eyes flickered over to Elijah for a moment, offering him a glance that was both knowing and supportive. "And that cross you're offended by," Slate continued, making sure his words were clear for everyone to hear, "that's his right." The mention of rights seemed to resonate with the passengers, and the air shifted again, this time with a subtle sense of solidarity. A few passengers, who had been watching with growing unease, now began to speak up. A young man, sitting to Elijah's left, leaned forward, looking at Gregory with skepticism. "I don't see any rule about crosses," he said, his voice low but pointed, as though unsure if his words would be well received but unwilling to remain silent. Behind him a woman chimed in, her voice a little more assured. "You didn't ask that guy to take off his Star of David or that lady her crescent pin," she remarked, her tone now sharp, exposing the inconsistency in Gregory's actions. The scene that had once felt isolated was slowly beginning to shift. The collective discomfort in the cabin was being broken open, piece by piece, as people realized the injustice of the situation. Gregory's confident stance faltered as Slate's words hit their mark. His jaw clenched, and his lips pressed into a thin line. His excuse, which had seemed so well constructed just moments earlier, now came across as fragile. "I'm just following protocol," Gregory muttered, trying to reassert control, his voice less sure than before. But even as he spoke, the words felt weak, stripped of their authority. The passengers weren't buying it. The truth was exposed, laid bare for all to see. Gregory's actions were not about protocol. They were about something else, something far more personal, something rooted in an unspoken bias that no set of airline rules could justify. For the first time since this whole ordeal began, Elijah felt something shift inside him. It wasn't triumph, nor vindication. It wasn't even relief. It was just a quiet, overwhelming weariness. He had stood firm, as he had always done, against injustice, against prejudice, against the subtle erosion of dignity. But now, as the situation shifted, he felt the weight of decades of these small but constant indignities pressing on him all at once. Years of watching the system twist and contort to accommodate everything except his humanity. Years of standing tall, not for accolades, but for survival. The exhaustion was palpable. He hadn't won a victory. He had simply endured once again. The atmosphere around him no longer felt hostile, but it was defensive, as though the passengers themselves had collectively realized the truth of what had just occurred. Gregory, now completely caught in the web of his own actions, began to retreat down the aisle, his shoulders hunched. The shift in tone was undeniable. Where before his movements had been authoritative, they now felt like a retreat. He looked at the faces of the passengers, but instead of receiving approval or solidarity, he saw only doubt. The weight of his actions, of overstepping his role, of misjudging the moment, now hung heavily in the air. His retreat wasn't just physical, it was symbolic. He had lost the support of the cabin, and with it the surety he had once held so tightly. Passengers began to murmur among themselves, exchanging glances, nodding in quiet agreement. Some spoke words of encouragement to Elijah. "You're doing the right thing," one man said quietly, his voice full of quiet respect. Others nodded in silent understanding. A woman near the front patted Elijah on the shoulder, a simple gesture, but it was enough. The power of the moment, of Reverend Marcus Slate's intervention, had shifted the tide. The weight of Elijah's silent protest had made it impossible for the injustice to go unchallenged any longer. But through it all, Elijah said little. He didn't smile. He didn't bask in the small victories. He was not triumphant. He was tired. He had long learned that standing up for what was right was often a lonely road, that even when others finally noticed, it was rarely in time to make a difference. He wasn't looking for applause or recognition. He wasn't looking for anything more than the dignity he had already earned by simply being himself, by simply existing. And in this moment, all he wanted was peace. Peace that he would not be granted on this flight, but perhaps, one day, in the world beyond it. As Gregory retreated, Slate took one last look at Elijah, a wordless acknowledgement of the strength that had carried him this far. The flight attendant moved out of view, the plane settling into a new rhythm, though the energy in the cabin was now charged with a quiet sense of reckoning. The battle wasn't over. But for a brief moment it felt as if justice had been delivered, not in the grand gestures, but in the quiet courage of standing firm. And perhaps in the end, that was all that mattered. The plane touches down with an eerie quiet hanging in the air. Usually there's the familiar buzz of passengers eagerly gathering their belongings, stretching stiff limbs after hours of confinement, but today feels different. Elijah remains seated, holding the small leather-bound Bible in his lap. His knuckles are white from gripping the book, a quiet symbol of his inner strength. Gregory's earlier demand has reverberated through the cabin, and the echoes of it still linger, thickening the atmosphere. Passengers look to each other, unsure of how to proceed, but Elijah remains steady, his shoulders squared as though the weight of the world isn't enough to move him. He has become the fulcrum around which all this tension pivots. The hum of the engines dies as the plane rolls toward the gate, and then comes the announcement, the kind that's always routine, that's always harmless. "Thank you for flying with us today. We hope you had a pleasant flight." But the words seem hollow in the charged air. Some passengers, having witnessed the small drama unfold, stare intently at their phones, while others glance at Elijah as though waiting for him to make a move, for him to break. The quiet is palpable, a collective holding of breath. Everyone knows something is coming. What exactly they don't know, but they feel it, in the stiffness of their movements, the way their eyes dart nervously around the cabin. It doesn't take long for the door to open. 2 TSA officers step through, their dark uniforms stark against the bright lights of the terminal. The silence inside the plane deepens as passengers crane their necks, eyes wide. No one speaks, but the collective gaze is uncomfortably heavy. Elijah stands slowly, still clutching his Bible. His posture is calm, unyielding. His cross remains on his chest, as it always has been, but it feels heavier now. The weight of it, the sacred symbol of his faith, is not lost on him. It is something much more significant in this moment. He feels it with every step, every breath. Reverend Marcus Slate stands too. With an air of authority that shifts the energy in the cabin, Slate walks down the aisle toward the front. His presence is not just imposing but steady, as though nothing, not the TSA officers, nor the attention of the passengers, could unbalance him. He's tall, and though his steps are measured and calm, there is a quiet power in them. When he reaches the front of the plane, his voice rings out, clear and firm. "You're harassing a pastor over a necklace?" The words don't shout, but they command attention, and in that moment, the tension in the cabin shifts. Heads turn, as people begin to stir with unease or curiosity. There's no room for silence anymore. The weight of the moment has tipped in Elijah's favor. The moment Gregory sees Slate, There's an immediate change in his expression, an uncomfortable realization that something beyond his control has entered the arena. The shift in the room is subtle, but undeniable. Gregory, standing frozen for a moment, seems to shrink a little. His authority is no longer unchallenged, and the confidence that had previously driven him to demand Elijah remove the cross begins to unravel. Slate's mere presence seems to break the facade Gregory had constructed. He tries to steady himself, but his earlier bravado falters. Slate, unfazed, continues to speak with measured calm. "This man is no threat. He's a pastor. And that cross you're offended by? That's his right." Slate's words are simple, but they have the weight of undeniable truth behind them. They are a declaration, and with each syllable, they chip away at Gregory's previous stance. One by one, passengers begin to lend their voices to the growing chorus of dissent. The young man seated to Elijah's left, who had been silent until now, speaks up, his voice carrying a quiet but unwavering conviction. "I don't see any rule about crosses," he says, looking directly at Gregory, as if daring him to respond. A woman further back chimes in as well, her tone challenging. "You didn't ask that guy to take off his Star of David, or that lady her crescent pin." The room's dynamic shifts again. No longer are the passengers simply bystanders. They are now participants, and some of them have chosen to side with Elijah, some quietly, some loudly, but all of them pushing against the injustice unfolding before them. There's a palpable shift in the air as the collective mood pivots away from support of Gregory to a kind of passive but undeniable solidarity with Elijah. Gregory, now visibly flustered, retreats a few steps, mumbling about following protocol, but it's a weak defense. The passengers don't buy it. Some openly shake their heads, others exchange glances of disbelief. The mask of professionalism that Gregory had worn so carefully is slipping, and in its place, the reality of his actions stands stark. The strength of Elijah's silent defiance, coupled with Slate's eloquent intervention, has exposed the undercurrent of bigotry in the situation. Elijah, ever the picture of grace, says nothing. He remains calm, almost detached, but the exhaustion is visible in the way his shoulders sag slightly, as though the weight of everything, all the years of quiet resistance, have caught up with him. It's a quiet moment, yet the silence is not one of peace. It's charged, waiting for something more. Elijah doesn't smile. He doesn't feel victorious. He doesn't need to. He has said what he needed to say with his actions. In this moment, he is a man at peace with himself, standing not in triumph, but in simple, quiet strength. There is nothing left to prove, but everything left to be said in the way the passengers look at him now, in the way they react to Gregory's retreat. Elijah stands as a beacon, not of protest, but of something deeper. His fight isn't for applause or public acclaim. It is for his right to be seen and respected as he is, not just as a black man, but as a human being with dignity. That is the victory in the end. As the situation begins to settle, Slate steps aside, offering Elijah the space he needs to take the next steps. Elijah stands still, his mind racing, but his body remains composed. He moves toward the exit, his cross gleaming faintly in the artificial light, a quiet defiance that lingers even as he steps off the plane. The moment has passed, but its echoes will remain long after the door has closed. Elijah steps onto the stage at the Interfaith Conference just hours later, the weight of the day still bearing down on him. His clothes are wrinkled from the hurried flight, and his eyes carry the faintest shadows of fatigue, though his shoulders remain square, his posture resolute. He has been through an ordeal, but as he takes his first step to the podium, there is no sign of that struggle on his face. The faint hum of the crowd murmurs like a soft undercurrent of water, ebbing and flowing with anticipation, unaware of the storm that had just passed through their speaker's life. The audience before him is full of people from all walks of faith, gathered together for a conversation on unity and healing, their expectations hanging heavy in the air. They are expecting a lecture on bridging divides, on the delicate dance of interfaith dialogue, and a sermon on the power of reconciliation. What they receive instead is something more raw, more immediate, and far more personal. Elijah's voice, quieter than usual, carries a depth that transcends the room's expectations. He begins not with lofty words about unity or faith or the grand ideals of peaceful coexistence. Instead, he begins with the story of a man on a plane. He speaks slowly at first, almost as though he's gathering his thoughts, but his words come out with clarity, each one deliberate, each one weighed down by the gravity of the moment. He tells them of a man who had not asked for a fight, a man who only wanted to be seen and understood. This man, a pastor, had been told to remove the cross his father carved for him by hand, a symbol of the faith that had carried him through years of hardship. Elijah speaks not with bitterness, but with the quiet firmness of one who knows that his story is not just his own, but a reflection of something far deeper, something all too familiar. His tone doesn't rise with anger, nor does it dip into despair. Instead, it settles in the steady rhythm of truth. He speaks of how prejudice can wear uniforms and speak in polite tones, how sometimes those who hold power are the ones who disguise their cruelty behind rules and regulations that hide the ugliness within. But he does not speak with malice. He speaks with the kind of clarity that can only come from someone who has lived through the quiet, pervasive injustices of the world, someone who knows that dignity is something that must be defended not with rage, but with presence. As Elijah continues, his story unfolds like a slow, deliberate stream of consciousness, each word a stone thrown into the waters of the audience's awareness. There are murmurs that ripple through the crowd as realization begins to settle on their faces. Some look to each other in quiet disbelief, while others reach for their phones to confirm what they are hearing. The truth is spreading, almost as quickly as Elijah's name begins to trend online. Video clips of the confrontation on the plane, of the calm defiance of the man who refused to be intimidated, are already circulating on the internet. But here, in this room, there is no mention of headlines or viral posts. Elijah simply speaks the truth that has always been there, just waiting for the right moment to be heard. The room is filled with a subtle energy now, a low hum of collective understanding that rises and falls like a quiet storm. There is no applause yet, only the soft stirrings of people realizing that they are hearing more than a speech. They are hearing the voice of a man who has lived through something that many would never see, yet it feels so close to home, so familiar, that they cannot help but listen. They see themselves in his words, in his story, and it strikes a chord deep within their hearts. Elijah doesn't speak about himself as a victim, nor does he invite sympathy. He speaks of faith, of the quiet power that comes from standing firm in the face of adversity, even when everything inside you wants to crumble. The more he speaks, the more the audience leans in, drawn into his calm strength. His voice never falters, even when the memory of the plane, of the harsh words, the unjust treatment, presses at the edges of his mind. He is here now, not just to recount the events of that flight, but to impart a deeper lesson. Elijah holds up the wooden cross, the symbol that was once a source of tension, now a quiet testament to his faith. "I didn't come here to fight," he says simply, his eyes sweeping over the room. "I came to remind us that sometimes faith isn't about words. It's about standing when someone asks you to bow." The words settle in the air like a heavy, unspoken promise. There is no need for grand gestures. There is no need for a call to action. Elijah's simple declaration holds enough weight for the room to grasp. Faith in that moment becomes more than a religious symbol. It becomes a human one. It becomes the act of standing in your truth, in your dignity, in the face of forces that seek to strip it away. The truth is clear. Sometimes the quietest stand is the most powerful one. As he finishes, a hush falls over the room. For a moment no one moves, as though they are all holding their breath in the same suspended space. Then, slowly, as if stirred by the sheer weight of what has been shared, the audience rises to their feet. Some clap, some wipe tears from their eyes, while others simply stand in silent acknowledgement. Elijah, humble as ever, stands still, almost overwhelmed by the response. He had not expected this, had not come here seeking any form of recognition or applause. But in this moment, he cannot ignore the fact that something has shifted, not just in the room, but in the hearts of those who are now standing with him without ever uttering a word. The applause dies down, and for a few seconds, the silence lingers again. The air is thick with a mix of reverence and admiration. Elijah stands there, not basking in the praise, but fully aware of the weight of what he has just shared. His shoulders are still squared, his gaze still steady, but now there's a quiet understanding that his journey has only just begun. This is not the end. It is, in some ways, only the beginning. There is more to this story, more to the fight for dignity, for faith, for standing when the world asks you to bow. But for now, in this room, he has planted the seed. The audience continues to watch him, some still processing, others moved to tears. Even the organizers, who had expected a lecture on unity, are now in awe of the quiet power of Elijah's words. His message has transcended politics and theology. It has become something more, something personal, something deeply human. And as the room begins to settle back into its seats, the knowledge that this moment will reverberate long after it ends hangs in the air, like a promise. Elijah knows that what he has shared will live on, not in headlines or viral posts, but in the hearts of those who have heard his story. The story is only just beginning. The wave of attention following the flight incident crashes over Elijah's life with the force of a tsunami. His story, one that was supposed to be simple, a humble reflection on faith, has become the centerpiece of a national dialogue. The viral video clips, now viewed millions of times, capture a moment of tension that resonates far beyond the confines of the airplane cabin. Elijah, once a man who silently served his small congregation, now finds himself a symbol of resilience, of resistance against unseen but insidious prejudices. He is invited to television programs, both religious and secular, and his phone rings constantly with requests for interviews, op-eds, and public appearances. The pressure is overwhelming, yet he remains resolute, avoiding the media frenzy, refusing to let his words be manipulated for the soundbite. His church, however, is filled with an entirely different kind of energy. A vigil is held in his honor, drawing both familiar faces and newcomers who seek solidarity. Many have heard of him but never attended his services, their interest now piqued not by his theological teachings, but by his unyielding stand in the face of personal assault. Despite the widespread attention, his congregation remains a place of refuge, where he's no longer the man who only stands behind the pulpit, but the person they can reach out to when their own dignity is under siege. The vigil, modest but filled with sincerity, takes place in the church parking lot. People gather, some carrying candles, others quietly praying, while a few passers-by join them, asking questions and offering their support. The vigil becomes a rallying point, not just for Elijah but for everyone who's ever been made to feel small, dismissed, or disrespected. Despite the growing number of calls and media requests, Elijah doesn't flinch. He remains rooted in the quiet, grounded wisdom he's carried throughout his life, never seeking the limelight but now finding himself thrust into it. He continues to focus on his faith, his family, and the message he's carried throughout his ministry, that justice is not something to wait for, but something to be actively sought. His sons, proud but concerned, take on a public role in supporting him. His older son, a school teacher, speaks to reporters with measured words, emphasizing that the story is not about celebrity, but about the broader implications of the incident on society. His younger son, a lawyer, quietly works behind the scenes, reaching out to civil rights groups to ensure that the legal ramifications of the situation don't fall into the cracks of bureaucracy and disinterest. Both sons remain grounded, understanding that the personal message of their father resonates on a deeper level than the headlines might suggest. Meanwhile, the airline's response, a public relations nightmare, only fuels the fire. Their vague statement promising an internal review falls flat with those who have been following the story. Civil rights organizations and public figures continue to raise their voices, pointing out the hypocrisy of an institution that claims to prioritize safety while allowing its employees to engage in racial and religious discrimination. The flight attendant, Gregory Miles, remains on administrative leave, but the damage to his credibility is done. Whether or not he is formally reprimanded remains a murky matter, but Elijah has no interest in vengeance. He never asked for the public spectacle. His aim has always been to simply call attention to a deeper issue, one that is systemic and often ignored. Reverend Marcus Slate, meanwhile, uses his own platform to push for changes in the airline industry. He addresses the wider issue of how clergy of color are often subjected to disproportionate scrutiny, not only in public spaces but within institutional settings. He calls for clearer policies regarding religious symbols, one that doesn't burden the individual, but instead safeguards their right to expression. His calls for reform spark dialogue in several sectors, from airlines to public policy, and a broader movement begins to take shape, though its true impact is still uncertain. For Elijah, Slate's support is invaluable, but he never seeks to overshadow the work he has done in his own community. He quietly whispers prayers for Gregory, not with anger, but with the understanding that the man's actions are part of a larger web of social injustice that cannot be ignored. Back at home, Elijah's desire for peace remains unbroken. He has achieved more than he could have imagined in terms of public awareness, but he has never sought fame. For him, the truest form of advocacy lies not in fighting for attention, but in holding steady to one's beliefs when the world seeks to knock you down. When asked about his next steps, his answer is simple. He wants to return to his life, his congregation, and his faith. He wants to pray, not for his own peace, but for those who remain trapped in cycles of prejudice and hate. In his heart, he knows this isn't over, not by a long shot. The journey, the real journey, is just beginning. As the media storm continues to rage outside, Elijah returns to the quiet, familiar rhythms of his ministry. He stands at the pulpit on Sunday morning, his voice still steady, his words still filled with grace. The events of the past few days have been an unexpected test, but Elijah knows that in the end his faith was never about finding peace in the absence of struggle, but in standing firm, unbowed, even in the face of the fiercest storms. The world may change around him, but his resolve remains unshaken. For Elijah Brooks, the fight is not over, and for those who have come to see him as a symbol, he's reminded them of the most important lesson. Faith is not passive. It is something to be lived each day with humility, strength, and the courage to speak out when the world tells you to be silent. A week later, the apology arrives in Elijah's hands, a simple envelope with no fanfare, no grand announcement. It is a letter from Gregory, handwritten, his penmanship uneven, the ink faint but sincere. The letter feels heavy in Elijah's hands, a physical representation of the weight that Gregory's words now carry. Elijah opens it slowly, unfolding the paper, the words coming into focus like a hesitant confession. Gregory admits that he overstepped, that his actions were driven by assumptions, by discomfort, and by the biases that even the most well-meaning can harbor. He writes that he saw something that unsettled him, a man with a cross around his neck, and instead of asking questions, instead of seeking understanding, he chose to silence it. Gregory acknowledges his mistake and asks for forgiveness, a request that feels as much for himself as it is for Elijah. The letter is not long, but it carries a weight of its own, the kind of weight that only comes when someone has had to face their own failure, their own shortcomings. Elijah reads the letter alone, sitting in the quiet of his church. The same church where he has preached for 23 years, where the worn wooden pews hold the memories of countless sermons and prayers. The letter, so full of humility, feels like a moment of reckoning for both men. But Elijah doesn't share it with anyone. He doesn't need to. The letter, in its quiet vulnerability, is not for public consumption. It's something personal, something between him and the man who once tried to take away his dignity. Instead, he places it in his Bible, next to the bookmark his wife gave him so many years ago. The bookmark, with its faded letters, reads, "Blessed are the peacemakers." Elijah closes the Bible, the letter tucked safely inside, and takes a deep breath. He is not angry, not even surprised. He is simply resolved. His own peace remains unshaken, and he is certain now that his mission in this world has always been about reconciliation, not vengeance. The response from the airline is swift and, to some, expected. Under immense pressure from the public and media, the company announces a sweeping policy change. There will be mandatory bias and sensitivity training for all staff, along with the introduction of a clergy protections clause to ensure that religious symbols, like the cross Elijah wears, will not be grounds for discrimination on future flights. The announcement is accompanied by the usual corporate statements of regret and assurances of progress, but the reality of it, for Elijah, is less about the airline's response and more about what will come of it. The compensation package, which includes a public commendation, free travel for life, and a monetary settlement, is offered to Elijah, but he declines it all. The recognition is hollow to him. What matters more is something else. Instead of accepting the compensation, he requests that the funds be used to create scholarships for young men of color who wish to pursue theology and community leadership. His request is simple, and it makes perfect sense to those who know him. He has always believed that the true strength of a community lies not in its ability to lift up the rich or the powerful, but in empowering those who are often overlooked. This is his way of turning the moment into something lasting, something that can help others stand firm in their faith, as he did. The media frenzy, which once threatened to consume him, begins to fade as quickly as it rose. The hashtags #cross on flight and #Pastor Elijah, which dominated news cycles, are replaced by other stories, other scandals, other headlines. But the ripples of Elijah's stand continue to echo in quieter, more personal spaces. His story lingers in the hearts and minds of those who watched it unfold, who found a part of themselves in his courage, his unwavering commitment to his faith. It remains a quiet testament to the power of standing firm in the face of adversity, to the way that one man's dignity can shine a light on the prejudices that often hide in the shadows. Gregory, once proud and rigid in his position, disappears from the public eye. His career is no longer the focus, nor is it ever again mentioned in the media. He becomes an afterthought in the larger story of what transpired, his apology a fleeting moment in the grander arc of justice that Elijah's actions have set in motion. Elijah, for his part, moves on. The moment has passed, but its effect lingers in the most profound ways. The Sunday following the public apology and the media frenzy, Elijah returns to his church. There are no cameras waiting for him outside, no reporters asking for sound bites. It is just another Sunday in the life of a pastor. His church, a quiet refuge in the heart of the city, is where he finds his true calling, away from the headlines and the noise of public life. The familiar faces of his congregation greet him, offering smiles and soft greetings. The comforting strains of gospel music fill the air, the gentle hum of prayer and hymn wrapping around him like a warm embrace. It feels like home, it feels like peace, and for Elijah, that is enough. He steps up to the pulpit, fingers brushing the cross around his neck, the same cross that started it all, the one his father carved for him, the one that was nearly taken from him, but never truly could be. He begins to preach, but not about justice or the headlines or the events of the past week. Instead, he speaks about love, the kind of love that bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, and endures all things. It is a message not of anger or resentment, but of understanding, of compassion, and of the unwavering belief that, in the end, love will always endure. The silence in the room is deeper than ever, but it is not a silence born of fear or uncertainty. It is a silence of reverence, of attentiveness. Every person in that room, from the oldest member to the youngest visitor, is listening, truly listening, as Elijah speaks not just to them, but through them, his words carrying the weight of a message that transcends the moment, transcends the story that has captivated the world. In that moment, Elijah understands something deeply. The story that started on a plane, with an unjust request to remove his cross, was never just about him. It was about all those who have ever been made to feel small, dismissed, or invisible. It was about the quiet acts of resistance that happen every day, not in the headlines, but in the hearts of those who refuse to bow to the forces that would strip them of their dignity. And as he speaks, with the cross around his neck and the truth in his heart, Elijah knows that, in the end, it was always about love, the kind of love that is unshakable, that defies every attempt to break it, and that is the greatest testament of all.